Good day, everyone. Good day. Glad to see everyone in the room and welcome everyone online, of whom we know there are very many. So please make sure you get your refreshments, but settle in because it's going to be a full and productive and fruitful day. And so we're really thrilled to have all of you here and joining us online. This is a community. I'm Ann Kurth. I'm the president of the New York Academy of Medicine, and it's an honor to bring you here today and to thank our planning committee that made that happen, because there's been a lot of work behind the scenes. But to have the wisdom of all of you engaged on this topic. It's been about a decade, right, since we had the last kind of large convening on this idea, pulling thought leaders together. It's banned Book Week. The accumulation of human knowledge that medical historical libraries represent, a treasure, a constant learning base, and challenges about how to make sure that it's accessible, that they're sustained, that they're utilized in the reality of delivering health around the world. So pleased to have you in our beautiful building here on Museum Mile. We've been at this for 177 years. New York Academy of Medicine is one of the longest running nonprofits in the United States. And our Medical Historical Library is an absolute gem and has been there from day one, as well as part of what we engage with and offer to the world. So I know that many of you have similar libraries or affiliations with similar libraries, so you've got experience, you've probably got challenges to share. What can we learn from each other about how we can best continue our contributions through our libraries into the future? All of you are leaders, US, internationally, so bring your brains, bring your ideas. It's really crucial to put our heads together on this, and looking forward to what comes forth from that. So now I'll welcome to the stage Dr. Paul Theerman. He's the director of our library and the Center in the History of Medicine and Public Health.
Thank you, Ann, and let me add my welcome to hers. I'm glad you're all here. It's a full room, and it's a full Zoom room as well. I'm very excited about the day and the speakers we have. One of the things I wanted to say, that the watchword as we've developed and planned this conference is participation. Participation between the speakers, one with another, but participation between the speakers and the audience, both in person and online. And also after the conference, and we have an email address that we'll be sharing with you at the very end of the conference so you can follow up with any thoughts or questions you have. We welcome your participation. It will make the conference better. This is also the library's first effort at a hybrid conference. We have an active audience joining us by Zoom, as I've mentioned, and this is all thanks to a very generous donor. Some of you have asked about Wi-Fi. Look in your programs, in your folders. There is a Wi-Fi connection there, both a network you can join as well as the password. Finally, if you're here in person, I hope you will be able to visit our rare book room, named in honor of Drs. Barry and Bobby Kohler. We have tours scheduled at 11:15, 3 o'clock, and after the conference right at 5 o'clock. I'm afraid tours are limited to 15 persons each. The room is a little tight, but worth it. And there are sign-up sheets at the check-in desk. Now let me pass to our first speaker. I'm now introduce Melissa Grafe, who will provide an overview of the day's activities and introduce our keynoter. My introduction will be short. In fact, that was it. As full biographical sketches of all the speakers are found on the conference event website. So please, Melissa.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to the future of historical medical libraries in the digital age. I would like to thank, thank all of our in-person and online attendees for joining us as we consider this larger theme throughout the day. I would also like to thank the New York Academy of Medicine, particularly Ann Kurth, Paul Theerman, and the larger planning committee for convening, supporting, and hosting this conference. This event builds on the themes of the 2013 conference on emerging roles for historical medical libraries, value in a digital age, held at the College of Physicians in Philadelphia. That conference brought together the optimism around digital materials and concerns about how this digital world would affect physical collections. In that time, online digital consortiums like the Medical Heritage Library, which included among its members the New York Academy of Medicine, the National Library of Medicine, and other academic and cultural institutions like Yale University, joined together to digitize huge swaths of their collection through grants from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, National Endowments for the Humanities, and other funders. Since then, libraries have digitized millions of books and other materials that unlock medical practices, providing opportunities for people worldwide to examine many aspects of medicine. Over the past 10 years, many people have come to rely on the internet as the main source of medical information, unlocked from the book and journal format. Yet, print and manuscript collections continue to serve important roles in this increasingly digital world, and we'll talk about that throughout the day. Many historical medical collections and libraries were built by doctors in the 19th and 20th centuries, although a few have longer lineages. These collections encompass medical knowledge, often going back centuries, and created a physical chain that linked the medical profession with a progressive narrative of the past. The collectors and donors that formed these libraries were often medical doctors and other professionals keenly interested in preserving, quote, the great names in medicine and science, as well as evidence of forms of, quote, quackery and other alternative strands in the field. In the latter part of the 20th century, particularly under the influence of social history, these same historical medical collections yielded different views on the profession, health, and disease. Collecting, in turn, turned towards everyday medicine and health, and social history led towards the realization that there were stories missing from the pages in a lot of these collections, and that these stories were often linked to racism, sexism, and other inequities that are found in medicine. In the medical field of the late 20th century, or we can go mid to late 20th century, an explosion of knowledge and the expanding use of technology created a growing volume of material that was often captured through journal articles. Many of you may remember, maybe not, back in the day where journal articles are still the kind of force by which medical research is presented. Medicine was one of the earlier fields to go online to share information, and there's been a long move away from paper collections in medicine, starting with e-journals in the 1990s and continuing with the advancement of electronic patient records today. Increasingly, the future of medicine is looking towards a deeper intertwining of technology on multiple levels. Massive data sets and analyzable through intelligent networks will continue to drive research. Artificial intelligence, enhancements in computer-assisted medicine, and virtual reality are part of medical work today. Looking at these larger trends, it is sometimes hard to imagine how physical medical historical collections work in the medical world. In the past, historical medical libraries were often the final home for the growing wave of medical information, which is often considered, I think even nowadays, outdated within like 2 to 3 years, I would imagine. But preservation of these materials was and is an important mission for these repositories. Digitization also plays an important role in this area as well, capturing images of physical material that might be too fragile to use. Today, with the growth of born digital material that never saw a physical manifestation, many libraries have developed digital repositories to house these archives for future research. Although there are great challenges around storing and servicing up this material. Beyond preservation, historical medical libraries provide material for classes, research, tours, one-off sessions, workshops for both medical and non-medical audiences. On any given day, historical medical libraries might serve up medieval manuscripts, prints and posters, the archives of individuals and institutions, and a wide variety of books in various fields. There is still a need to interact with the physical material, which often provides important clues around its use as an object and its greater history. Outreach and teaching are core parts of many medical historical library services, and combining both physical and digital collections to help audiences engage with medical history is as important today and as it was in the past. But we're at a critical juncture in the interplay of historical medical libraries and medicine today. It's clear that historical medical libraries have challenges systematically collecting this massive wave of digital information that often operates beyond any physical walls and strains the resources of most institutions. This brings me to the themes of today's event, and I want to highlight the three broader questions our speakers will attempt to tackle. First question is, what new roles are historical medical libraries taking up in today's world? Second one, what interplay between technology and collections, both physical and digital, can best serve historical libraries' new roles? And finally, what new organization structures would best enable historical libraries to fulfill their new roles? In our lunchtime presentation, Dr. Jeremy Green will reflect on the future of the past in academic medicine, rethinking the historical role of the medical library. At the end of the day, I'll leave it to my colleague, Sandra Aya Enemel, to bring together some of these strands as she discusses what we've learned, what we still need to know, and next steps. While these questions can apply more broadly to many special collections, I want to emphasize the important relationship between historical medical libraries and the medical community. These collections often exist because the medical field understood the importance of knowing its own history. And while there's often very little time allotted in medical education to engaging this history due to the overwhelming amount of knowledge society requires of its medical practitioners, that history shapes the profession today. Whether it's reaching back through history to understand worldwide pandemics, which COVID-19 forced the world to do as people reflected on health measures in the 1918 flu pandemic, or trying to understand how systematic racism and inequities persist in medicine today, historical medical libraries provide avenues of research and learning. This morning, I am delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Trevor Owens. Dr. Owens is a social scientist, historian, and archivist, and currently serves as the first Chief Research Officer of the American Institute of Physics. In this role, he's charged with implementing and leading AIP's new operational unit, AIP Research. On top of his role as Chief Research Officer, Dr. Owens is also a public historian in residence at American University and a faculty member for California's Rare Book School. Dr. Owens' career has spanned several large cultural and academic institutions, mainly at the federal level, I'll say. He previously worked as the Director of Digital Services at the Library of Congress, where he oversaw a budget of more than $21 million a year and more than 100 staff involved in collections, digitization, metadata management, collections discovery, digital preservation, web archiving, business analysis, and virtual volunteer engagement. Before that, he worked as a senior program officer and as Assistant Deputy Director for Libraries at the United States Institute of Museum and Library Services, the IMLS. He has also worked on digital preservation strategy and as a historian of science at the Library of Congress. Before joining the Library of Congress, he led the outreach and communication efforts for the open source Zotero digital research tool at the Center for History and New Media at George Mason University. Many of you might be familiar with Zotero as a citation manager. It's a favorite among many humanities scholars. Dr. Owens is the author of 4 books, the most recent of which, After Disruption, A Future for Cultural Memory, was published by the University of Michigan Press in spring of 2024. His previous book, The Theory and Craft of Digital Preservation, published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2018, won Outstanding Publication Awards from both the American Library Association and the Society of American Archivists. He will discuss both books in the course of his presentation. Dr. Owens authored or co-authored over 20 articles in library, museum, and digital humanities journals. He's also been recognized in the profession through various awards and scholarships, including the Frederick G. Kilgore Award for Research in Library and Information Technology from the American Library Association in 2021. We are moving fast through our presentations this morning, but I think you guys are ready to hear Dr. Owens. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Owens as he presents on Catching Up to the Digital Present, A Future for History of Science, Technology, and Medicine Collections.
we'll see if I've got, is there a clicker for advancing, or what's the?
Should be on the desk.
Press, okay, there we go. Well, thank you so much for that fantastic and thoughtful introduction. I'm delighted to be here today with all of you to kick off this meeting. Some of you might be wondering what someone from the American Institute of Physics is doing here at an event about medical libraries, but I hope that will become apparent. I think there's some really important connections between science, technology, and medicine collections in general, and those are things I hope to draw out. So I'm going to start out by sharing a little roadmap for my talk today. I'll share the initial questions that we're all here to talk about and just sort of give a few thoughts on them. I'm not going to delve too far into them since that's what we're here to get into through the rest of the day. Then I'll talk about a few points from my two books, which were mentioned in the introduction, thinking about digital preservation and digital futures. I'll then give a little bit of context from the work we're doing at the American Institute of Physics on the future of our Niels Bohr Library and Archives, the role it serves and its function. I think that will be useful. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about 5 illustrative case studies, some specific objects, material resources that I think are helpful for thinking through some of the questions we're here to discuss. And then I'll share a little bit about approaches going forward, some general themes, and some examples of ways that I'm thinking about this work in my role at AIP. So here's the whole list of convening questions. I'm not going to go through them in detail here, but I do want to draw out that I think central to what we're talking about is some questions about audience, some questions about the role of technology in our work, and questions about what the nature of collections are going forward. And we've got sort of historical collections from our lengthy past, going into analog media, coming into digital, and then increasingly born digital materials that we need to attend to and think about. But the questions here about audiences, I think, are really important and central, and those will be, I think, really interesting things for us to delve into and think about as we work through this discussion. So to start off, as mentioned earlier, I approach most of my work from these two books that I've worked on. So in 2018, The Theory and Craft of Digital Preservation, which really emerged through my efforts to teach digital preservation courses to graduate students, and really trying to anchor the idea of the work of digital preservation in a craft tradition, what we've learned and understand. We're really at a point now where it seems like discussions of digital preservation are always emergent, but we've really been doing this for half a century. We have materials that are born digital that we've had for half a century that we continue to provide access to. And the jumping off point from that into after disruption, a future from cultural memory, will become apparent as I work through this a little bit. So the beginning of my digital preservation book is in a bit of a hyperbole kind of anxiety space that we find ourselves on. Articles like this continue to show up. This is from Inc. magazine. What we post online is forever, and we need a reminder. So this is there generally to sort of scare young people, I think, right? Don't put that thing on the internet because it might be there forever and haunt you, right? And then at the same time, we'll see something like this shortly after that, right? There's going to be this digital dark age. It's all going to disappear. And so I don't know, maybe it's the things we least want. Those are the things that will be around forever, and the things we actually care about, those are the ones we worry about. But a lot of this is tied up in the fact that the anxieties we have are real, and the even sort of the black box nature of digital information, right? Where are the bits on a disk? Things kind of seem to disappear. Can you find that file? Those sorts of things. And increasingly, as we work with computers, that things in the cloud, right, where the cloud is just hard drives elsewhere, right? That digital feels even more immaterial than it had in the past, and so. The book really works through that sort of starting point with hype and digital anxiety, and then moves into questions around the lineages of preservation, where we come to. And an important thing that will be a theme I'll return to repeatedly throughout the talk, when it comes to digital information, there's a really challenging context collapse that's emerged, right? So we have traditions like art conservation, really anchored in work on the materiality of artworks, and we have, things like preservation reformatting and microfilming, things that really were different traditions that now have collapsed together because really all the production of information now is born digital. Even if you get a book, it's really a printout of a PDF somewhere, right? Like really we have analog surrogates of digital information now at this point that is the basis of most of the material we're working to engage with. And so working through that, understanding digital objects, drawing out the challenges and opportunities of digital preservation, and then ultimately establishing an approach to craft for thinking about digital preservation, the way that those lineages come together, and the fact that we really do have more than half a century now of work to ensure enduring access to digital information to build on. And so I like these two contrasting responses to the book. On the one hand, David Ferriero from the Archivist of the United States gave me this blurb on the back of the book about how the book connects with a wide tradition of memory-keeping practices, really that we have this lineage. And then at the same time, Kyle's review in American Archivist, drawing out that a lot of what I'm talking about in the book is also a corrective to a highly technical approach to thinking about digital preservation. Ultimately, the book ends with a chapter called Tools for Looking Forward, where I try to make the case that ultimately, the work in digital preservation, and I would argue more broadly in libraries, is that we have to start thinking like futurists as well. So preservation really is just access in the future. And so if we need to be thinking about 50 years from now, 100 years from now, how is someone going to access this information? And when we do think about digital materials, at first blush, there's some really important things to engage with. Are people going to have a keyboard and a mouse when they interact with this thing 50 years from now? What assumptions do we have about those computing environments? Are people going to be using VR headsets, et cetera, right? All these voice ways of interacting with material. How's that going to work when we have, Carl Sagan's floppy disks 100 years from now? So those questions are important, but very quickly those turn, when you start thinking like a futurist, the technical questions are not the most important questions. The 50, 100 years from now questions about libraries and archives, what's society going to be like? How are we going to invest in public goods? What value do we have in trust, in integrity of sources? These kinds of questions sort of spiral you out, and that's where After Disruption comes from, my most recent book, sort of a jumping off from that set of questions. A lot of this book ends up being a reflection on sort of my wayward early parts of my career. When I was at the Center for History and New Media, I was a technology evangelist, helping sort of sell digital humanities things. And at that point, I'm really proud of the work we did there. And I was involved in, but at the same point, seeing how technology has played out, some of the early things that we were focused on, right? There were, I remember having discussions, what do we need scholarly societies for? When we have Twitter, we can all talk to each other. And then what became of Twitter, right? The trust that we put in our institutions is really important, and it's fascinating to watch how they've evolved. So this book ends up, and if you're curious, it's an open access book as well, so you can get it from the University of Michigan Press. The first half of the book, it focuses on what I diagnose as a set of sort of bankrupt ideologies, things that are really sort of Silicon Valley style thinking that is actually rather shallow. So disruptive innovation, data-driven decision making, and then a lot of work around hustle culture, ways to think about how sort of pushing people to work more and more, pushing them to their limits, that are all actually very disruptive. There's a lot of problems to them. In the second half of the book, I try to focus on a couple different things that I think are opportunities, ways to reframe some of this. Drawing on a lot of work in maintenance, care, and repair to think about the roles that our institutions can play in really helping heal some of these disruptive things that we've been a part of. That there is considerable value and importance, but at the same time, the repair point, right, that there's actually harm that institutions have caused as well, and that we have an opportunity to reflect and work and repair. So ultimately, I should underscore that I'm not sort of a technology naysayer in this case. I think there's tremendous potential, and I'll illustrate that in some of the examples that I get into in the talk. But we have an opportunity here to really take those technologies and make sure that they're fit to our missions and our goals as institutions to carry forward into the future. And so that's what I think we have a chance to do and to think about with collections, but sort of not to just turn the wheel over to the tech sector folks that think they have all the answers. Because there are really powerful things that technology can do, but it's also, there's this lineage that we've been a part of for 50, 100, 200 years that we need to make sure we're providing continuity on. So I draw on a lot of literature in the book, and I'll put this quote up from Michelle Caswell, because I think it's particularly important for thinking about themes for the future of collections. So specifically that really this fits with that repair theme, that our archives are not representative of the communities that we serve in many cases. And so a lot of work is going on to address this. But I think this gets back to the audience's question that we'll be returning to repeatedly, which is ultimately, I think the most powerful thing that we have with collections in our areas is as sites of belonging and inclusion, as places where we can help support and change narratives about whose voice counts, what history matters. These things are not sort of academic questions. They're actually very core questions about who we are and where we fit in our social worlds. And so I think Michelle really prompts us into some important thinking here. I encourage everyone to explore more of her work as well. She's sort of a leading thinker in archives. So I'm going to pivot a little bit now and talk a little bit about sort of what it is I'm doing at the American Institute of Physics and what that has to do with what we're doing today. Give a little context. I think the work we're doing and that we're engaged in, which I'm really lucky to be a part of a team that's thinking a lot about this, is focused on questions about the future role of STEM with two M's, right? We've got medicine in there as well, libraries. So I'm the first chief research officer at the American Institute of Physics. It brings together our library and archives team, our history programs, and our social science and statistical researchers, really to manifest the research institute function of our organization. We're both a federation of scientific societies in the physical sciences and a research institute. And so in work to look across what we do, we've come up with this way of talking about that work, right? So we have history and policy research, we have statistical research, we have library and archives practices. But in terms of thinking about what that work is, whether it's something like oral histories or our history newsletter, our collection management function, you can think about the cross-cutting sort of verticals of that as connecting, helping people connect with our collections and engage with them. Collecting, we collect and preserve materials. We create content, we help tell stories and surface stories. And then we're also curating, we're preserving and collecting material. And so all of those things come together for a different way of thinking about our work. And within that, we're now thinking increasingly about this in terms of AIP research as this sort of interactive space between our physical science communities on the one hand. So we have AIP's member societies. Our library and archives is the home of 8 of the 10 member societies that we support institutional records. So there's a really important history function there for the societies. But then we also have Physics Today, which reaches members of all of those societies. Their readers, we have students in the Student Physics Society. FYI is our public policy newsletter. So those are really our stakeholders, are physical scientists in the physical sciences community, right? And then on the other end, there's these disciplinary research communities that we come from. We have teams of historians of science, we have librarians and archivists, we have policy researchers and social scientists. And so increasingly thinking about how we sort of build positive cycles of interacting between those communities that really are communities here. And this is one of the things that I think becomes challenging with digital technology, is it becomes possible to imagine yourself as having everyone being your audience, the general public, these sorts of things. That's actually very challenging to do. And in our case, I think this is the case for many, for the library parts, libraries and archives, as opposed to museums or science centers, that the general public really isn't a viable place to think about focusing our energy, but that there is actually a lot of important value to getting sort of a legacy mindset within the science communities that we connect with. And so within that, we've come to to think about thematic areas of focus of our work. So in a lot of ways, we've been talking about our work in the past by the way we do it, right? History, archives, statistical research. Now we're increasingly talking about our work because of the why we do it, right? So we're supporting a culture of inclusion and belonging in the physical sciences. We're doing that with oral histories. We're doing that with fellowships. We're doing that with statistical research on the field. We're working to advance equitable public policy in the physical sciences. We're working on ensuring records of 20th and 21st century science are preserved and used. And we're promoting vibrant career trajectories for physics science professionals. So if we go back to that slide I showed you earlier of those different capacities and functions that we work in, they're all to these goals, right? And these goals are things that resonate with folks within our disciplinary communities, right? Historians, librarians, archivists, social scientists, and they also resonate with our stakeholders in the physical sciences communities, because those are those spaces that we're bridging. And what's worth underscoring is that these points are not really brand new, right? That this isn't sort of a big shift for us. This is Robert Oppenheimer speaking at the opening of our library in 1962. And the points I'd really underscore here is in those remarks, part of the reason we founded a library was that it could serve as the hearth where we could have serious students come to explore discoveries in the sciences, which are among the greatest epics, or the great epics in our tradition, right? So if we go back to one of those opening questions, what is the connection to humanities or scholars within these resources, it's worth underscoring that this concept was there from the beginning, this legacy mindset within the creation of these institutions, that these are stories that need to be understood, that the personal stories are really important, and that this is part of the mission that we've had since the beginning. Okay, so now I'm going to take another spin, and I'm going to give us a tour through 5 very different kinds of collection objects. I think each of these can serve as markers or materials to think through and question some of what the future of our work is. Across all of these, I'll be bridging things that work to mess with some of the ways that we categorize sources or think about the way we do our work. So there's, within libraries and archives, there's a lot of discussion historically about sort of rare versus widely available materials, published versus unpublished, textual materials or informational records versus artifactual ones, sort of different approaches and traditions for working with books or journals, manuscripts, et cetera, and then these professional traditions, librarianship, archivists, folklorists, oral history, et cetera. So in our born digital world, as I was arguing a little earlier, we're seeing a continual collapse of those contexts. All of those things are hard to parse, and you'll see that as we move through some of these examples. So I'll start with Carl Sagan's floppy disks. So here they are. Here's 2 of Carl Sagan's floppy disks. There are about 400 of these that came in as part of the papers of Carl Sagan at the Library of Congress. They collectively hold about 18,000 WordPerfect files. So WordPerfect, great piece of technology. It still runs and functions, but that's a lot of text. And so you might be thinking, oh, Carl Sagan must have been a big computer user. He really wasn't, which is interesting. So when working with the collections, I was able to get one of these tape recorder tapes digitized. So this is, you can go online and see this if you want as part of an online collection. It's chapter 3 of the novel Contact. Carl Sagan's writing practice at that point in time, really in the 80s and 90s, was that he dictated everything. He dictated correspondence. He dictated, if you play this, it starts and he goes, well, I think chapter 3 starts something like this. And he just goes into it. It's amazing. I can't understand how you can dictate a novel, right? But he would, and then the archive is full of things that look like this, right? So this is a printout of a WordPerfect file that came from a dictated tape, right? And then he'd mark it up and he'd send it back and it'd get retyped and then that'd come through and that's on another WordPerfect file. So at this point, we really get this interesting sort of history of technology about how he produced work, what he was doing. But there's actually a lot of redundancy here, right? We've got these markups, we've got the tapes are kind of the original thing, but then the transcripts are in there and the WordPerfect files. And so someone might even say, like, do we really need the WordPerfect files if we've got the paper, if we've got the tapes? But what's really interesting is that because those WordPerfect files are born digital, you can search through them. They're full text already, right? not only are they kind of interesting as records, but what you're seeing here is a prototype interface that a colleague and I worked on years ago, Ed Summers. Ed gets all the credit. He made the thing. I had the idea for it, and then he did this. But what he did is he extracted all the text from those, turned them into HTML documents, and then ran them through a topic modeling tool called Mallet, which does the natural language processing technique that parses out topics based on co-occurrence of terms. So for instance, if you're really interested in the bag of words that is nuclear, world war, United Soviet States, people, global earth, weapons, okay, you kind of get a sense of what he's writing about there. 1,800 of those files have that. If you click on that, you can go and read those ones, right? So this is an emergent sort of structural order that comes out of them. And you can think about tools like this as being things that would support and improve both the processing of collections, right? This sort of tool makes it really easy to quickly winnow down into different sections of these files, but they're also really powerful access tools. And I think that's a thing that we'll get into repeatedly in some of my examples, that the power for AI tool, and AI is a little bit funky, and right now the buzzwords around AI are really focused on generative AI. I think in the long game, things like machine learning, computer vision, a lot of the other technologies that are part of AI are just as interesting. We were obsessed with algorithms and what algorithms were doing, a few years ago, and that's functionally part of the same bucket of things, right? Sort of social construct about what we mean with these terms. So that's a bit about Carl Sagan's floppy disks. So the next one I'll talk about is Edward Lorenz's mail. So for those unfamiliar, Edward Lorenz is a huge deal in meteorology and mathematics, who was involved in the development of complexity and chaos theory. And so if you do go, Edward Lorenz's papers are also at the Library of Congress. And if you read the finding aid, it's an eye chart, so I'm sure no one can catch it. But there's a thing that says digital ID, and you can see in there that there is a disk that came along with one of these things. And so here's the disk. Demonstrations of several controls of Lorenz systems. And I love that it's got little angle brackets on it that says start to begin the program, right? And so personal papers collections largely built up of correspondence in many cases, right? Correspondence is the core of that. Enclosures, are something that has been a part of correspondence forever, right? You can enclose just about anything. In this case, a disk was enclosed, and if you do put that disk in and hit start, you get something that works like this. If you have the right computing environment, you have to put in some variables, and then I don't have the video of it, but if you hit, it actually plays out this strange attractor effect, which is one of the things that Lorenz was hugely phenomenal and important in developing. But what's really wild in here, right, is that inside an enclosed letter is actually a complex computer simulation that requires a specific computing environment to run. And so, like in terms of how to work with this, really people have got to go and look at things that are almost more like museum conservation around working with born digital works, right? This is a complex computing program that was just folded into a letter. And when we think about that, if we were thinking about what Lorenz's correspondence would be at this point, right? It's likely email, right? That is, and that email attachment would have been, that computing program. And so it's hard to underscore how important email preservation is as a problem. And it's weird because it actually sounds incredibly boring to many people when you talk about it. But just think about how much of your life is in email. What isn't in an email, right? That is extant. And so the work that's gone into figuring out how to deal with email collections and work with them is hugely important for personal papers going forward. But it's similarly going to be very important for organizational records. And so on that front, here's a connection to medicine. One of the great collections we have at the Niels Bohr Library and Archives is records of the American Association of Physicists in Medicine, one of our 10 member societies. And so I thought I'd pull up examples, and you won't really be able to see them but well from the back, but you can tell kind of from the structure, right, that this letter from 1985 with a paperclip on it is attached to a salary survey report, right? So this is a report that was published. The one next to it from 1997 is a printout of an email, right? So this is actually this is an analog surrogate of a digital thing. If you can't probably see it from the back, but if you went in close on there, it has a WordPerfect file attached to it. So those WordPerfect files aren't going anywhere. They're going to be a big part of our work. But the reason we need to be attending to this is that the print and file it phase is coming to an end, right? Particularly post-pandemic. As we're in the beginning stages of starting to figure out and really make a core plan for how we deal with electronic records in our own organization and with our societies, because the future of organizational records is going to be born digital, and figuring out how to bring those in, manage them, support access to them. This has been a thing we've been forecasting for a long time, but it's now really real, right? And it's hard to underscore how important organizational records are as historical resources that, in our case specifically with member societies, the kinds of arguments that are happening within those societies really have tremendous, connect with all sorts of political, social issues as well. So I've got two more examples I'm going to run through that I think probe this a little further. And so one of them is the Health and Medicine Blogs Web Archive at the National Library of Medicine, which I'm delighted that Jeff is here, who was part of supporting this great work that NLM has done. I think the thing that's important here, right, is blogs of patients, physicians, nurses, and other individuals in healthcare fields. What are these? Like, how do you compare this to things that you have in your collections, right? So Life as a Healthcare CIO is one of the blogs in that collection. And so you've got sort of daily reflections. Is this published? Well, it's public, but who's the publisher? You just hit publish became a button, right? And it's like a very different function. It's more like a diary in some ways. But the other interesting thing about web content, right, is while this is a dated post from January of 2013, if the author of it went back and edited it at any point, they could do that, right? Because it's not fixed in the same way that other kinds of media are. And so the main point, I think, with this is that the explosive growth of content in the web really has changed the game in terms of thinking about how we find and preserve material. Now I'm showing an illustration here of some work that I did with Ben Lee, an information scientist at the University of Washington. The thing that's really mind-blowing about web content like this is the scale of it, right? So when I was working at the Library of Congress, we have 170 million items that we report, but there's actually 20 billion files in the Library of Congress web archives, right? And it's sort of like a mind-bending math thing, right? How can there be 20 billion things inside 170 million things? It's a challenge. In any event, what we did here is we took the first pages of all of a set of PDFs extracted from government websites and visually clustered them using some machine learning techniques. And so if you see that there's a bunch of black squares and there's another set of squares that's sort of visually interesting, and so I'll blow those up. The black squares are actually all redacted pages on the first pages of PDFs, which the idea that you can just say filter and show me redacted pages is really fascinating. You sort of learn something about the cluster, but it becomes a way to interact with those materials. The other set there is a set of maps that get clustered. You might not think of PDFs and maps as being a big part of this, but it appears that within the government documents, these are a huge part of the material. So the point, again, is that these computational tools can surface and filter and help us do things. These are things that might be useful for archivists or librarians who are looking to identify which sets of material need to be kept or described in different ways. They're also useful for end users. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is Grateful Med. And so how many people are familiar with Grateful Med? Any fans? Great. That was familiar. I'll take all the familiar folks as also being fans. So for those unfamiliar, Grateful Med was a database application that allowed you to interface with medical literature created by the National Library of Medicine. And so Nicole was brought on as a digital stewardship resident in 2016 to work through figuring out what preserving that would mean. And it's actually an incredibly hard question to think through. So the report she did is fantastic. I'd encourage everyone to explore it. But here you can see staff configuring Grateful Med in 1985. Interestingly, this is a record in the collection, right? So this is a preserved item. Here you can see a printout of a bunch of data that is part of Grateful Med. The quote on it, which I think is fascinating, these cards describe, God save it, the glorious citation file. But so interesting, what is, this thing existed for, across 2 decades. It has all these different instantiations. It's really an interface to data. It's not sort of software in and of itself. So how do you even think about preserving something like that? And what's really interesting is that through her work, Nicole surfaced this resource called How to Grateful Med, which is a tutorial for Grateful Med, which is actually a much easier thing to preserve. And so that's what they did. You can go and download it. You get up the right environment. You can play it. It's got canned searches in it, so it teaches you both how to use the software and sort of records it. But the important thing is that when effort was put into thinking about what you would document about this resource, this turned up to be a relatively simple, discrete thing that could be preserved, and then it could be part of a broader narrative and reference the other materials. But the important point here is that this is a very, it requires sort of discussion about what matters, questioning a lot of things about why you would or wouldn't collect things, discussion with different stakeholders to surface that. So if we come back to that slide I had earlier about categorizing sources, I think you can see the ways that things like rare and widely available, published, unpublished, textual, artifactual, the formats, their different professional traditions, they're really coalescing in together as digital information continues to change a lot of the ways that that media is produced and that we need to work on collecting and preserving it. And so for going forward, I'll talk through these 4 points, which I think are things we can return to throughout the day, and then give a few practical examples of how I see that working. The first is that preservation intent, trust, and custody are even more important than they've been in the past, that we have to be very intentional about what we're collecting, why we're collecting it, and that particularly when you think about the effects of things like large language models and what's going on with AI, that trust and integrity in sources is all the more important. And so being places that are trustworthy and that actually have custody of the content becomes really critical. Proactive things like web archiving and doing oral histories also becomes all the more important. That we have some documentation strategies and sort of intentional modes of going out and acquiring material are increasingly important in places where it's harder to do things according to the way that we used to bring in media and work with it. Then the next point is that as I hope several of my examples showed, that the potential for computational tools to scale processing and access is really important for dealing with the scale of material we have. I think the specific examples will escape me, but it's one of those things where if you take something like photography, right, more photos have been taken in like the last couple years, right, than in the entire history of the world before that, right? And that is a thing that's replaying out in all these different categories. And so scaling the approaches that we work with processing and access is important for that too. And then the last one, which is the thing that I think is a really exciting thing about some of the community we have here today, is that collaborations between historians, librarians, archivists, and STEM professionals are all the more important because we can't take for granted a bunch of the things we might have assumed where media was sort of a little more steady state in the past. And so some examples that I'll share as ways forward. This is, this summer, we have a long-standing thing where interns from the Society of Physics students, undergraduates, will come and work with us in our history library archives programs. And so Kai came and worked with us this summer, and one of the things that really lit him up in his work was wanting to help diversify our oral history collections. And so he went out and conducted oral histories, and then he also wrote this piece for our blog about the power of oral history. And what I think is significant here, right, is that it's really important that he brought in Kay Renee Horton and Dr. Jan Eldridge's stories into our collection. They're a part of the collection going forward. But it's also really important for him to have done that, right? And so this is a thing that's sort of part of the legacy mindset that we're engaging with, but it's students, it's intergenerational dialogue, right? And that sort of storytelling function is something that I think is incredibly powerful and important for us to be thinking about here too. This is one of my favorite items in the collection. Shakespeare got it wrong. It's not to be, it's to do. The Memoirs of a Geophysicist by Jack Oliver. And if you read the preface, which I've put up a big chunk of it, but the main thing I want to hit here is that he opens by saying this autobiography was stimulated by a joint request from the Committee on the History of Geophysics of the American Geophysical Union and the Center for the History of Physics at the American Institute of Physics. This exists because it was asked for, right? It was solicited and invited. We might not have this at all. I think there's 2 extant copies of it at least that I know of. One of them was digitized by his alma mater and is available online. But we wouldn't have this story or this history at all if it hadn't been proactively solicited. I'd underscore that this is even more powerful now. So this is Steve Dick's family history and memoir. Steve was a historian working with NASA for his whole career. It's an amazing resource, and he sent us a PDF of it. We cleared it with him, and it's available for anyone to read online, right? We don't need to digitize this. The text is all readable, but this sort of relationship we can have, the sort of legacy mindset function that we've had in the past is even easier now. Because he's opted into it, we have the rights and permission to be able to make it openly available. And if you want, you can go download the whole thing right now and read it. So for me, this prompts a few different ways about thinking of an organization like the Niels Bohr Library and Archives, that you can think of it as a laboratory for developing belonging-centered archival futures. You can think about it, in some ways it operates as a memorial to these physical scientists, right? The people whose stories we're stewarding. But it's also a cultivator of legacy mindset among our scientific community. We invite people into the space and they can think about their day-to-day in a little bit of a different way, right? That this is a chance to see the work we're doing as part of that legacy, to think about being in the space Oppenheimer was in, talking about, the hearth of these epics. And then it can also, as we saw with Kai's example, be a facilitator of intergenerational, interdisciplinary dialogue between scientists, historians, and social scientists. And that it can also be a trusted resource in an increasingly untrusting world. So I'll end here with the convening questions up on the screen. And I'm hoping that I've ended with enough time here for a good bit of question time. But I want to thank you all for this chance to share with you. I think Melissa's coming up to help field questions together.
I can see some questions already, so let's get this started. We'll start with, I think there are microphones there and there that might be working. Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, we'll start with the gentleman in the jacket there, and then we'll follow up with you then. We'll start there.
Thank you. I was working on digital preservation about a little over 20 years ago, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on emulation. Like Grateful Med made me think of that. What is the thinking now? Do you want a universal emulator or sort of domain specific?
Great question. And so there's been some really great strides in virtualization and emulation that are making a lot of progress. One of the ones I'd point to is that the Internet Archive hosts an amazingly web-enabled emulator, so you can go play old video games, all kinds of people do. And so JSMS, which is the technology that uses, is incredibly powerful. And then on the other end, the Software Preservation Network is a group largely anchored on work at Yale over time as well, focused on using an emulation as a service framework that a team out of Freiburg in Germany originated, which is also quite powerful. And so there's with that said, even at a basic level, like the Lorenz attractor example I was showing there, archivists at the Library of Congress were able to boot up open source software tools and get an environment in which you could play it and run it. And so the technology is really advanced in a lot of ways, in many cases supporting web-enabled delivery. There's still some complicated issues around, you need the right operating system, the right version of a sound card, all of these kind of technical things that are still challenging. But I think the emerging state of it, I think, is increasingly that virtualization and emulation is a very real and practical thing that people are using to enable access to collections.
If you go over there, yeah.
Thank you. I really love what you said about intergenerational and interdisciplinary. And I was curious, for those of us who teach health profession students, when you think about how to get those other disciplines students to work with your collections in physics, or are there conversations about your institute working with the other institutes that have interdisciplinary connections? What's the value of getting a health student to come and think about what stories need to be told in the intersectionality between health and physics, for example?
And that's a great question. I think there's a lot of opportunities there. I think that the first thing I'd offer there is the more specific we are about our audiences and our organization stakeholders, I think the better off we'll be at being able to tailor things to them. But The key thing there, I think, ends up being about taking a user-centered mindset and thinking about user journeys, because I think I often default into thinking about things according to sort of my own sets of assumptions, but what is it that's going to make this material interesting and useful to someone who's, you know, working in public health or something like that, and sort of backwards working into it. So getting really specific kind of user audience segments, talking with them, thinking about that is important. In our case, we're going to be doing that a lot with physical scientists, because that's our starting point. And in that case too, that you know, physicists in medicine being one of those examples. But then sort of getting those connections into the other places where we have stakeholders, with historians of science, for instance. But thank you for that.
We'll take Bill next. Go ahead, Bill, and then we'll join you then. Go ahead, Bill.
I think you hit a lot of very interesting topics here. One that it seems to me you haven't talked enough about is stability problems. Some of us, you know, remember 50 years ago we had microfilms which we cannot read. They are tape recordings which we cannot read. There's newspapers from 50, 75 years ago which are deteriorated. We believe that the technology of digitization is going to be different, it seems. Yet I'm sure that 500 years from now, we will not be able to read most of the stuff we have. And so the migration always has to be going on into the new programs. I mean, I have Multimate files that I can't deal with, if you remember Multimate. But anyhow, what can we do to solve this problem? I mean, print it out on acid-free paper with iron ink, but put it on a high shelf, but what else?
That's great questions, and I think the good, on the one hand, one of the challenging things with digital information is it's incredibly fragile, right? You trip and you drop the disk and now it's broken, right? And recovering it's incredibly difficult. At the same time, the thing that's great about I should start and draw a line between two different things. Bit preservation is not fully realizing digital preservation, but bit preservation is actually a very simple problem. Do I have exactly the same bits I had before? And the good news is that one is actually pretty well solved, making lots of copies, making sure they're exactly the same. That's pretty straightforward. When you get into, you know, can you run that old piece of software? Much more challenging. But the virtualization emulation stuff tends to work there. So interestingly, the good news there is that because it's so easy to replicate copies and check them to make sure they're exactly the same, we get out of a bunch of problems we had with sort of like the continual churn of work it takes to migrate things to different AV media, for instance. Really, at this point, the idea is you make new digital masters that are at the highest level of quality, and we've got pretty solid standards that I think we have every reason to believe we'll be able to play back well in digital systems 50 or 100 years from now. But I think the biggest durability question is that maintenance of digital infrastructure is a constant, right? That you can't just stop paying your bills for your cloud storage, right? Everything's gone. And so the sustainability factors end up becoming a little different, but they're different sorts of challenges. So thank you for that.
Please.
I sort of perceive your sort of overall concept of three things. You know, you got preservation and what you want to do about preservation. Then you have engagement, which you really didn't talk that much about, I didn't think. You know, how do you engage, you know, your physicists, your early physicists, your medical students, you know, your people in you know, who are doing physics and are really the leaders in AI as far as in the high schools now. So how do you engage those people? And I'm coming from a medical world where I use artificial intelligence every day. And then you go into, do you actually get anything at the end? You know, does all this work actually get you something that's more useful for the society? So how do you deal with that arc?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great, I think one of those engagement points is finding people who want to talk about the future and history of the field and their communities. And I think in those cases, things like oral history, or a thing that we've done, AIP was pretty early in the development of documentation strategies as an approach for identifying materials to collect. So actually engaging with experts in the community now to say what's going to matter 50 or 100 years from now to be documented and preserved. So I think there's an opportunity for engagement on what to collect. And then at the same time, I think your broader point too about how the material is made useful and supported is important. And I think I'd note there is in the case of something like our oral history collection, the main place, some people do come and read our oral histories, right? And so we do get context that someone's like, I want to hear my grandfather's voice. Can I hear the audio recording, right? Those are really powerful moments of connecting with people in our community. But the big way that people are going to benefit from, say, Vera Rubin's oral histories that we have, a couple of, is that when you pick up the great biography of Vera Rubin, the back half of it is all citations to her papers at the Library of Congress where they're preserved. But the front several chapters, the footnotes there are all references to these oral histories we have. They're the only way that got there. And so ultimately, a lot of that access, I think, is helping bring users of the collections who might be historians or other types of researchers into dialogue and showing what products they can make from that tell those stories that are going to be more engaging too. So those are a couple initial thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Actually, I'm going to jump in. We have a question from online. Considering so much of the current STEM with another M research is born digital and behind a paywall, what can be done to ensure those resources are available in the future for continued study?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, and I think so one thing that's great to underscore is within the medicine world, PubMed Central is an amazing resource that makes so much and the ongoing work about a transition to open access is hugely important and complex, but it is persisting. Now within that, I think that journal literature is really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of thinking about what makes up historical collections. So I'm personally not that worried about journal literature. I think it's largely a solved problem. A lot of work and effort has gone into ensuring access to journals. But when you get into those things like organizational records, personal papers, this is not a solved problem. And I think we've made a lot of really good advances in how to work with born digital personal papers. Really the last decade has been transformational in getting from something that seemed like a pie in the sky sort of idea to something that's actually practical everyday work that can be done. But resourcing people to do that work, getting the handoffs to have, I mean, even technical, right, like how many different email accounts have you had over your career and where are those emails, right? Like I've got a Gmail account, sometimes that's personal, sometimes it's quasi-professional. Like just your correspondence is at a sort of fundamentally different state. And so a lot of those challenges around electronic records management, I think, are the much harder ones that we have a lot of work to do.
I think I did see a question. Would you mind using the microphone just so we can all hear? Thank you.
So I have a related question regarding access to email archives, because as you know, it can be so difficult to get access to those archives for data protection, copyright, technical reasons. So do you have any perhaps solutions to solve this issue of access?
Sure. So there's a couple different approaches that folks have taken, and I think that it's largely a question of sort of fit to purpose for different needs. I was really glad that when I was at IMLS to be able to support the EPAD project, which comes out of Stanford, which is an amazing set of resources. Again, a case where machine learning and AI tools actually say these people are probably the same people, all kinds of ways of taking the technical metadata in email and servicing it. But you're very right that those questions of redaction and access, personal information become really important. And I think in some cases, it's going to be important to embargo materials for periods of time. In other cases, we've got public records laws that relate to some portions of collections, and so you'll see PDFs of huge amounts of emails that just get dumped out on the web and they become sources. And then in other cases, I think we're going to be in situations where a lot of digital repository platforms now have ways to enable either on-site only access to materials, where there's still the kind of interactions that happen to talk with someone about what to do with collections, or where there's sort of virtual mediation that happens. But at the end of the day, I don't see the problems with email as being radically different than the problems with any sets of correspondence. The same issues are there. The Carl Sagan papers, there's a bunch of letters from children to him, right? And how do you mediate and think through those things? But I think one of the biggest things with them is that it's often going to make sense. While it's possible to say put everything online on the web, particularly for more contemporary materials, we're likely going to just need to work with them in more restricted ways and somewhat more mediated ways to sort of replicate the ways that we've handled some of those issues about usability and discoverability with correspondence in other collections.
Great, thank you so much, Sean.
I'm going to hit you with one last question, I think. I'm going to use this moment here. So, Trevor, you've worked with very large institutions, and the AIP, I'm not sure how large, but certainly not as large as Library of Congress, right? So I think the question is, for institutions that are smaller in size and don't have the technical capabilities or staffing or capacity to address some of the things that you're seeing in the digital futures here, what would be, maybe some experiences, or what would be your suggestions on how these smaller groups or smaller institutions can do some of the work that you have here?
Thank you. That's a great. What I would say there is that a lot of work that we did with the National Digital Stewardship Alliance early on to develop things like there's a framework for sort of progressive standards to use around approaching digital preservation. That in many cases, it's actually easier to address a lot of the most pressing concerns at a small organization that sort of, you likely have less content that you need to deal with that's born digital. Getting the boxes off the floor in a digital space, which is sort of, if you went into an archive and saw all the boxes on the floor, you wouldn't start saying, you guys need really great finding aids. You'd be like, get the boxes off the floor, right? And I think one of the challenges is helping people in the digital environment get into the get the boxes off the floor mindset instead of the sort of perfect, complicated preservation metadata schema. And getting the boxes off the floor is like, do you know what you should be keeping? Do you have an inventory of the files you have? Do you have processes whereby you check those relatively frequently? So that boxes off the floor work is in some ways easier when you're at a smaller organization. And commodity IT tools, do you have I met once, I was getting coffee with someone at National Council of Public History conference. They worked at a house museum and they were going to a complex sort of wet workshop about some preservation metadata. And I said, what is the most important material you have? Oh, we have these oral histories. Oh, where are they? Oh, they're on this one computer in the office. And it's like, don't go to that workshop. Buy a second hard drive and make copies of those things and take it home. Get a Dropbox account. Put that stuff. Like it's, I think the technology can often be sort of overwhelming, and thinking about, especially within library and archives, there's a tendency to want to do it right, especially because we're confronted constantly with like, oh, we bound all those things before. Like you just sort of walk through an archives and you see the history of all of these sort of like things that we now think of as not the best practices for how to manage or deal with things. But thank goodness people did what they did at those points, because we still have them, right? Like we have to intervene, we have to take action. And so there are a lot of good. The National Digital Stewardship Alliance does have some great materials that are sort of helpful in that get the boxes off the floor mode. But I'd also underscore that there's some really fascinating newer organizations. Michelle Caswell, who I brought up, has been involved with Southeast Asian American Digital Archive, which is a community archives. It's a very small organization that operates an online first digital repository for their community's history. And it's tremendously powerful. It needs more support and resourcing, but a lot of growth that's happened in community archives is tremendously powerful. And in many ways, I think it speaks to the fact that our organizations and institutions haven't been as immersed in communities, often have been involved in somewhat extractive approaches, taking things, putting them behind, things that require you to go through a bunch of security guards and things like that to get into access to collections. But the more we can think about how we can legitimately engage more directly with communities, the better off we'd, I think, be. But there's a lot of good opportunities for, and what I will say too is not being at a giant organization is great too, because the complexity around decision-making around, say, IT infrastructure, IT security, those things become exponentially harder with the larger your organization is. And so in many cases, smaller organizations are much more nimble in their ability to respond to them.
So I think we'll wrap up, but thank you so much for answering those questions. Join me in thanking Trevor.